to the Sawtooth Interpretive Station's latest forum and lecture series program, and we're calling it this year The Adventure Starts Here. And we have a unique adventure tonight with Bighorn sheep. But for those who don't know me, I'm Gary Gadwell, past president of CHA, and I'd like to begin by thanking our sponsors. Our primary sponsors for this year's programs are the Redfish Lake Lodge and the Roland McNichol family. The McNichol family gave a tremendous donation to us in memory of Roland McNichol. He was a staunch advocate for the Forum and Lecture Series. He barely ever missed one. He had a special seat every time. He sat right there, and he was a real steward to the Sawtooth country. We just lost him this past year. Wonderful gentleman. We're a member-based, not-for-profit organization. We rely on memberships and book and map sales and a few grants, and donations are especially important to us. We have membership information. Oops, over here. Sorry, I'm looking in the wrong direction. We have membership information over here. We also have information on the trail here. It's the Valley is a very special place, and folks may consider buying a memorial brick or a brick to give their favorite saying, but this is your pathway to Sawtooth Valley history. There's 145 inscribed bricks on here right now. So the mission of CHA is to protect and advance the natural and cultural history of the Sawtooth Salmon River country. And we meet part of that goal by having these forum and lecture series. We've been doing this since 2006, and I think they just get better and better every year. Been having great turnout, and welcome you all here. Just curious how many members of CHA there are here tonight. Raise your hand. Quite a bunch. That's wonderful. Well, like I said, we are a member-based organization, and we really appreciate the support of our members. And we have several of our naturalists here today as well. They're in the blue shirts scattered around. So we have a fundraiser this year. The last 2 years we did a telescope, and this year our executive director came up with the great idea of having an adventure pack. So we're having a drawing, and that drawing will be at the Salmon Festival. You don't have to be there to win, but we'll have a drawing, and there's about $500 value in this entire kit. You can purchase tickets tonight, one for $5 or five for $20. We try to have a fundraising effort each year, and this is one. And you also notice over there our new dip jar. There's a way to donate to CHA by dipping your credit card in that little gadget there, and it'll take $5 out of your account, just boom, just like that. I think it's a pretty impressive little deal. That's a dip jar, and it doesn't take any more than $5. It's set for $5. We could maybe raise that, but I don't think that would set so well. Anyway, I'm going to let one of our great naturalists, Hannah Fake, will introduce our speaker for tonight.
Welcome, and thank you all for coming to our 6th lecture of the 2019 season. The 2019 lecture series will focus on adventures, stories, and experiences we can all have while we're here in the Sawtooths. Dr. Cassirer is a wildlife research biologist with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, stationed in Lewiston. She has been studying bighorn sheep in Idaho for 20 years, focused on restoration in the Hells Canyon, and has also worked on the Salmon River and eastern Idaho populations. This presentation will cover the history, biology, and management of mountain sheep in central Idaho. Please welcome Cassirer and wild sheep.
Can you guys hear me? It's not on?
It's on.
It's on? Oh, maybe I need to move the mic. Okay, is that better? It's a little distracting. Yeah, thank you so much for asking me to come here today, and to Hannah for her introduction. I was really excited to have an excuse to come to this beautiful place. Thank you. And so yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to start out with, hope I'm not in the way for anybody. I'm going to start out with sort of some basic information about bighorn sheep, and then I'll talk a little bit about their populations and kind of the limiting factors for bighorn sheep, some of the science that we've done, both here and in Hell's Canyon where I work. And then I'll talk a little bit about the management and, yeah. So to start out with, bighorn sheep have a lot of fans. Maybe some of you are them, and I am also. And I've kind of thought about why people, I like all animals, but bighorn sheep are super popular, and I've thought about why they are, and maybe I'm not the best person to determine that because I like all animals, but I'm going to just tell you a few things that I think are special about bighorn sheep or interesting. And first of all, I think one thing that's really interesting and kind of draws people in is their eyes. And they have these beautiful golden brown eyes. They're really big, and they are very visual animals. They certainly have great sense of smell and hearing, but they really use the visual confirmation, and so they can spend a long time just watching. And some people have told me that their vision is like 10 power, so like a 10 power binoculars, and I don't know if that's true, but what I know is that when I'm glassing for sheep, a lot of times it'll take me quite a while to find them, and often when I find them, they're just looking right at me. Also, the places that sheep live, now sometimes you can see them right by the road, but most of their life they usually spend in some really awesome places, whether it's alpine country or desert canyon, river canyons in the desert. And it's beautiful country, and it's also very challenging, so often it's quite an experience to go look for sheep. Both, as you probably know, both males and females have horns. This is a ram skull, and this is a ewe skull here. These are two rams. Now the rams, the one in front is a yearling, and the one in the back is the 2-year-old. And the yearlings often look like ewes, but you can tell that they're rams because the bases and the whole horn really is thicker than a ewe, and also it flares more. Ewes tend to go straight back, but there is a lot of variation in bighorn sheep horns, and that's one thing you can use to distinguish individuals. And bighorn sheep are also very social. They're group living animals, and that's one thing that's really interesting about watching them, is to see all the social interactions. This is a ewe group, but there is one yearling ram in there. Can anybody tell me which one is the ram? Right in front, right. So you can see how his horns kind of flare out. And also, if you look at the ewe next to him, she's got kind of a big nose. You can tell that she's an older animal, whereas he still has pretty much of a baby face, and his body is also pretty small. So the males and females spend most of their life apart, except for during the breeding season. The males they tend to go to places where there's really good forage, so they have good food to eat, and they just spend their time together, sparring. They're also very social, and they're not really aggressive, but they just kind of like to harass each other. And you notice on the last, and then in the fall is when they really do the clashing of the horns, which they're famous for. And you might have noticed on the last picture that ram had a big chip out of his horn. Okay, it only goes one way. But so if you ever watch them when they're ramming each other, they usually don't do it head on. They kind of do it to the side, and that's how they get those chips out of their horns. So when the rams are, so another thing, I've got a few videos here. I'll see if this works. I'll try to switch to the video. So one other thing that's really cool about sheep is how agile they are. And if you've ever spent any time in the mountains, you can see how it's kind of bumpy, but they're just so smooth and just solid muscle. And if you've ever tried to get around in the mountains where the sheep are, it never looks like that. Okay, so while the rams are doing their thing, something I didn't practice. So the ewes are raising the lambs, and ewes usually have one lamb each year, but they bring their lambs together when they're a week or more old, and then they have they live in these nursery groups. And the lambs are also, they're very cool to watch. They're just love to be together and playing. So much for my great multimedia. So these are just some pictures of the lambs in their groups. There's really nothing cuter than a bighorn lamb. And this is them when they're a month or two old, just goofing around. And they often have this little smile on their face. So, talking about bighorn sheep populations in Idaho, they were historically very abundant. And in Hell's Canyon, there have been, from the archaeological evidence and paleontological evidence, they've been there at least 7,000 years. So the bighorn sheep have been here thousands and thousands of years. They were important to the Native Americans. They're the most commonly depicted animal in the rock art in a lot of the canyons. And in some places, they were probably more common than deer. But by about 100 years after Europeans had showed up on the scene, they'd been extirpated from many areas in surrounding Idaho. And the reason for this was unregulated hunting, even market hunting for the miners. So you can imagine how many sheep there must have been there if people were living off them. There was competition with the settlers brought their livestock with them, and so there's competition for forage. There was habitat degradation, and this affected a lot of species, during that time, including deer and elk. But the one thing that's different with sheep is that they also were susceptible to diseases that were carried by the livestock. And so today, this is the distribution of sheep in Idaho. The black is our native populations, and the yellow are reintroduced. And so Stanley's right here, and the closest population to Stanley is in the White Clouds. They summer in the White Clouds, and they winter on the East Fork of the Salmon. Also, there's sheep in the Middle Fork and what we call the Middle Main, the north side of the Salmon. And surrounding it in the Lost River, the Lemhi, the Beaverheads, Hell's Canyon, and in southwestern Idaho, sheep have been reintroduced. So how many sheep do you think we have in Idaho today? I'm giving you, this is multiple choice. Remember, there's like more sheep than deer. Like, we have hundreds of thousands of deer in Idaho today. So obviously we don't have that many sheep today. I don't know how many deer there were back in the day, but anybody have an idea of how many sheep? 3,000? I should have a prize. It's 3,000. And we think that even just in the areas where they still exist, if they were fully, if there were enough sheep to what the habitat could support, we would have 16,000. So,
do you mean when you're 16, that would support all the available habitat would support them, or just in the habitat where they exist now?
It's very conservative. It's just the habitat where they exist now, not private land, just in areas where we are managing for sheep.
Okay.
So if you look at this, is our Bighorn sheep management plan. It's online. But if you ever you need some trivia about bighorn sheep in Idaho, it's probably in there. And we also did have our habitat modeling where we show for each population how many sheep we think the habitat could support. So I was really interested today. I found out that somebody here has an old bighorn sheep skull that is grown into a tree. And these old skulls are incredibly valuable. And there's a fellow that some of you might have heard of, John Kerry, who was an amateur historian. He was born in the early 1900s, and he grew up on the South Fork of the Salmon. And he wrote a couple of books, one about the Salmon River, or he wrote along with Court Conley and Ace Barton, about the history of the Salmon River and the Snake River. And he lived near Riggins. And he was also a big fan of bighorn sheep. We had something in common. And he collected over 100 skulls and horns that he either found or people brought to him on the salmon and its tributaries. And he also, and the oldest was from 1879, and he was very meticulous about it, and he recorded where each skull came from. And so we did a study that today, this part of the collection, much of the collection is gone now, but part of the collection is in the Jack O'Connor Center in Hell's Gate State Park in Lewiston, which is another museum. And we were able to get horn shavings from 34 of John Kerry's, the sheep that John Kerry had collected, and we extracted DNA for them. And so here's where John Kerry, the collection comes from. Here's Stanley again, and the red is where his horns were from. So on the lower, what we call the lower salmon, which is above Riggins. Is this thing kind of fading in and out, or is it just? It's fine. Okay, thanks. And then there was a few from the Middle Fork. And these in the purple are samples that we have from today, contemporary samples from these populations. And this is just a picture of some of the heads and how he wrote on each head where it was from. And you can also see that some of these skulls the horns were pretty old. So we get the DNA from the horn sheath itself, not from the bone. And when the horns are that old, it makes it the DNA degrades, so it makes it hard to get samples. But we were able to extract usable DNA from 25 sheep, and we looked at two things. One is the genetic diversity, and the way we measure that is how many unique forms of a gene are there in the sample, so that like only one individual has this form of the gene. So how different do the animals actually genetically are they from each other? And when we look at our contemporary samples, we had 93 samples from the Middle Fork. There was only 2 genes that there was a unique allele. And the lower salmon, we had 111 samples, and there were no unique alleles. But in the Kerry collection, we only had 25 sheep, and we had 13 unique alleles. The other thing we looked at is gene flow, and that's movements of animals between populations. And in this plot, we have the lower salmon on the left, and then the Kerry collection in the middle, and then the Middle Fork on the right. And so if you look at the top bar here, if we ask it to split it into two categories, it'll split out the lower salmon, which is in green, and each one of these lines is a different individual. So it's showing that there's mixing of these different types, but in general, the lower salmon is mostly green, the Middle Fork is mostly red, and the Kerry collection actually is mostly red, even though most of the samples were from the lower salmon. So that suggests that there was a lot more gene flow back then between the lower salmon and the Middle Fork. And in the bottom, if we try to cluster the samples into 4, you can see that the lower salmon is different from the Middle Fork. So that suggests that those populations have drifted apart genetically, which is and if you look at the Middle Fork, at the Kerry collection, it's got representations from both of those populations. So it's the most diverse. And so the factors that affect genetic diversity and gene flow are population size and connectivity. So clearly, this indicates that just as we thought, the populations are a lot smaller than they used to be, and they also aren't as connected. And this is the lower salmon. Today, the lower salmon, the Middle Fork, the habitat has not really changed, relatively in the last couple hundred years. So there's not really any barriers to gene flow. It's probably just because the populations are so small. And why are the populations so small? Well, because as I sort of alluded to earlier, bighorn sheep are susceptible to diseases that are carried by domestic sheep, and they can get them either directly from domestic sheep or indirectly from other bighorn sheep. And this has been shown by, since we've known this for a long time, like since the 1930s, when people have either inadvertently or intentionally put bighorn sheep and domestic sheep together in a pen. The bighorn sheep die and the domestic sheep stay healthy. And why is this? Well, bighorn sheep and domestic sheep have diverged over 1 million years ago, but they're still genetically very similar, although apparently their immune systems are different. But they can still breed and produce viable offspring, and so they're probably similar enough that there's not any barrier for pathogens coming from domestic sheep to bighorn sheep. Yep. There are multiple pathogens, which is another way of saying it's a polymicrobial disease, or saying that. And this has really caused a lot of problems for trying to figure out what specifically causes the disease. So people have thought it was lungworms or Pasteurella, you might have heard of if you're a sheep junkie. But it was really hard to tell what it was, because when you find a dead bighorn sheep and you test it, it's got a lot of different organisms in it, and if you have an outbreak where a bunch of sheep die at the same time, each one might have some different bacteria in it. But actually, pneumonia bighorn sheep is a little bit like AIDS, where AIDS is initiated by the virus HIV, but people don't die from HIV. They die from a whole slew of things, because the HIV compromises their immune system. And so in bighorn sheep, the HIV is called Mycoplasma pneumoniae, or MOV. And it was first identified by Dr. Tom Besser at WSU. And it's what we call a primary agent. So it just predisposes, it doesn't actually kill the animal, it just predisposes them to respiratory infection. And it is a apparently host-specific to sheep and goats. So OV pneumonia, ovis is the genus of sheep. And this is, so once we figured out what the predisposing, or what the primary pathogen was, we were able to go back in Hell's Canyon to, historically, Hell's Canyon has a long history of pneumonia outbreaks, and when people found dead sheep, they would bring them into the diagnostic lab and they would do their necropsy, and then they fixed some of the lung tissue in formalin. So we went back and were able to extract the DNA from the formalin and find the MOV and strain type it. And so just like the flu, there's a lot of different strains of MOV. And in this plot on the right we have 5 different strains, 5 different colors, and we can track those strains through time. So on the, or I guess that's on the left for you. On the right is a map of the bighorn sheep populations in Hell's Canyon. That's what we call a metapopulation. They're interconnected populations. This is about an 8,900 square mile area, so it's really big country, and there's about 17 different bighorn sheep populations in there. And so just to kind of give you an idea of what we've seen, in 1986 there was a pneumonia outbreak in the Lewiston population in the Wallowa Mountains in Oregon, and it was 65% mortality, and we detected this orangish MOV strain, and then we never found that strain again. And the population, after a few years, it recovered, and we never detected the strain again. Then in 1992, we detected there was an outbreak in Washington in the Mountain View population. Again, we found this strain once. It was associated with 63% mortality outbreak, and then we didn't see it again. And then in 1995, there was a pneumonia outbreak that was in several populations in Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. And this is the blue strain here. So it spread. We think it started in Washington. And then it just kept moving around in the population, spread probably by bighorn sheep as they move between populations. And it caused outbreaks as it went through the population. And then in 2000, we detected another MOV strain. I don't know if you can read that, was 65% mortality. And then that strain started to spread through the population. So all of these strains coming in they have to come from somewhere, and so they must be coming from domestic sheep and goats. Since that's the most likely source for them. There are other animals that can carry MOV, but they are primarily in domestic sheep and goats. So every one of these is what we call a spillover event, where they've had contact probably with domestic sheep or goats. And so they just keep persisting in the population, causing, and I'll talk more about what they do when they persist in the population like this, and moving through. And for a while we seemed to only have one strain, and then in 2013 we got another strain in, and that strain was limited to the northern part of the population. So what we see in the pattern that we see are these disease outbreaks, and then they're followed by disease persistence. So we have this like 60% disease outbreak, and it would be fine. It would be fine, but it would be a lot better if then the population just had a bad year and then recovered. But most of the animals do recover in terms of they get rid of the MOV, but there's about 10% usually, can be more, that become carriers of MOV. And if they're ewe, they will infect their lamb. And the lambs don't have immunity, and the disease will spread fast. You saw these nursery groups thinking daycare kids, it's going to go right through the population, and it can kill up to 100% of the lambs.
What would be the normal mortality in lambs if it gets here?
about 40%, maybe 30-40%. It sort of depends, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, 100% is not sustainable. So the lambs, it's a very terrible disease. They get the MOB from their moms, and then again, it doesn't kill them right away. It just compromises their immune system. And I have some video of a sick lamb, but since the video isn't working that well and it's pretty depressing, you can just use your imagination. But only reason I wanted to show it was because it's something that's really influenced me to try to find a solution, is watching lambs dying, you know, and finding a lot of, I mean, we've probably picked up 100 dead lambs in our study, and they're not collared or anything, we just find them. So that's a pretty good motivator to solve a problem. And there's two things that we could do. We could reduce the risk of exposure of bighorn sheep to domestic sheep and goats, or to other infected bighorn sheep. Or maybe we could find a way to increase their ability, reduce their susceptibility, so increase their resilience, and so that either they don't get the disease or it's not as severe. And right now our management direction is to reduce risk. So to try to keep, and that mainly involves keeping domestic sheep and goats separate from bighorn sheep. And the reason we're very interested in trying to increase resilience, we just don't know how to do it. This is sort of ongoing research. We do know there's no antibiotics or vaccines that can be used. So probably some of you, like in the Forest Service, may be familiar with that there's two very opposing perceptions of this strategy. This is a newsletter from the American sheep industry, and there was a decision on the Payette National Forest to close some allotments that were deemed a risk to bighorn sheep and bighorn sheep population viability, and the American sheep industry felt it was threatening their entire industry. On the other hand, the wildlife folks thought this was a big win. So working through this, is something that this isn't going to go away. We both have to understand. The wildlife people have to understand domestic sheep are always going to be around. The domestic sheep people have to understand bighorn sheep are always going to have to be around. We have to figure out a way to work around this. Luckily, that's not my job, but I'll talk about that a little bit because I think it's really important. But right now, they're on public lands that are managed for wildlife. For example, Hell's Canyon is a national recreation area, Sawtooth's national recreation area. So wildlife has a higher standing than in other Forest Service lands. And generally, bighorn sheep so generally domestic sheep would not be allowed to graze in those areas. But wildlife don't have those maps. And so they'll come into town, they'll go on private land, they'll go outside the recreation area. So what I think is really important, we need to work through the public lands issues, definitely, but we also need to work on private lands that are in areas that could be used by bighorn sheep. And I think we have to be collaborative, and most people don't have domestic sheep, so just encourage them to keep doing what they're doing. And there has to be some give and take. We have to understand what would work for a person that has domestic sheep, and they need to understand what the science is, and we have to work together with the veterinarians and animal scientists, not just a wildlife message. And so this is something that we just did in near Hell's Canyon, where we had a public meeting, and actually this pathogen, MOB, is also not that great for domestic sheep. It's not as severe as it is for bighorn sheep, but it turns out that it can reduce the weight gain of lambs, and it can cause some additional mortality in adults, some sickness in adults. So we've been trying to reach out to the domestic sheep and goat community to talk about this issue and how they can help their flock by getting rid of MOE, and we have some ways they can do that. There's no vaccines or antibiotics, but just like in bighorn sheep, there are carrier domestic sheep, and so you can do it with some culling or some segregation. And we've also done it in chalice, and it's been really well received, so then people can sign up for the program, and we'll do all the testing for free. We'll also do a biosecurity screen for free, which is just something that's kind of good to have if you're going to take your animals to the fair or to the sale to show that they don't have some other diseases that could be bad for domestic sheep. So really trying to encourage this to happen. It's going to be slow, but I think it's definitely necessary.
Is it economically feasible with the resources to do a culling program among the carrier in the wild sheep population, in the bighorn population?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. So again, we're talking here in Hell's Canyon, and I've just been talking about reducing risk of exposure to domestic sheep, but yeah, what about to other bighorn sheep? And so, I can't go back, but so anyway, so we decided to just try to do that, exactly that, is to test every ewe in the population. And so first we have to capture the sheep to test them, and we have a number of ways wildlife biologists are very good at trying to figure out how to capture things, and we've got a lot of different ways, but probably the main way we do it is with a helicopter shooting a net onto a sheep. And then we test them. They bring up that sheep to us. We test them. And we actually have a test that we can do right on site. And our criteria is that if they're positive 2 years in a row, then they will be removed. And we've been removing them. We've been doing some work in captivity, and we've been that's how what we've been doing with the sheep that we've removed, is doing research on them. And so, I don't know if you can see this very well, but these are the 16 populations in Hell's Canyon in 2012. And when we first started this, or before we started it, and there were only 2 populations that didn't have MOB, one way up in the north and one down on the south. Huh. And then in 2013 and 14, we did our testing, and then 2015 we removed 2 sheep from this population right here. And then in later on 2015, we did testing, and we found no evidence. Any animal that was born in 2015 had no evidence of exposure to MOB and was negative. And then we start testing a lot of populations each year. We didn't test every population each year. That's why we have some unknown MOB status. And then we also removed some sheep from this population. We removed 8 sheep from this population in 2014. And by 2017, these next 2 populations were tested negative for exposure and continued on. And then this year, and we actually didn't remove any more sheep after that. So, which doesn't mean that sheep didn't die, or that population that they didn't lose some carriers, but we didn't do anything. And so this year was just amazing to me. In March, we captured sheep, and we had, 3 more populations that were negative for MOB. And so this next year, we're going to go back and continue on. But I think one thing and we have a population here too that's still positive, so we still have some work to do. We're kind of running into wilderness now, so it's a little bit more difficult for us to use a helicopter, but we'll figure something out. But the thing that I think is really encouraging is that we didn't really have to remove that many sheep. And when you have an interconnected population like this, maybe just removing sheep from key areas maybe that is just sort of helping sort of the natural clearance of MOB. And since most of Idaho's populations, like all the populations around here, are infected with MOB, and they're also connected, that's made us kind of wary about trying to do this here. But I don't know, I'm starting to get more optimistic. So maybe we have some, we were responsible for the decline of these beautiful animals, but maybe we have some opportunity here to kind of turn things around. And it really depends on public support, and among other things. But both individuals and conservation and hunting organizations have spent a lot of time and energy, and also funding, have also provided funding for a lot of the research that we've done. And I think it's really up to people to decide what do they want, what's important. And so I'd like to also give credit to people that I've been working with in our Bighorn Sheep Disease Research Consortium. We have a website. These are a couple of people I want to point out. Tom Besser, who just retired, who was the one that was responsible for figuring out that it was MOV. And then next to him is Raina Plowright, who's currently professor at Montana State University, and she's brought in some new ideas that helped us understand the idea that there were these persistent carriers. And also two other people whose names aren't up here are Dr. Lisette Waits and Dr. Kim Andrews at University of Idaho, who are geneticists and in bioinformatics. And also, we do spend a lot of time in the air. Either, we've had some great helicopter companies that have caught our sheep for us safely. We've caught hundreds of sheep in Hell's Canyon. And then we also use aircraft to monitor the sheep. And we use fixed wing. This is our ship of choice, the Cessna, single engine Cessna 182. And I guess it's been 22 years I've been doing this, but every month I fly in this aircraft at least once a month. And I put this in here because Doug Gadwa is the owner of the company that I fly with, and he just retired, and his brother's here in the audience. I wanted to give him a shout out. And also I'd like to thank our funders, the State Wildlife Management Agencies, the Nez Perce Umatilla Tribes, the wild sheep organizations and universities, and Morris Animal Foundation, and Pittman Robertson, or also known as Sportfish Wildlife Restoration. So, thank you all for coming. It was great to talk to you. Yes, this is the time.
You mentioned early on the fact that sheep exist in, I think of as the mountain country and in the desert canyon country. The desert canyon country, domestic sheep raising is pretty rare. I'm thinking of like the canyons of the Green and the San Juan. I live in southern Colorado, New Mexico. It's pretty unusual for me to see domestic sheep in the same environment where we see bighorn sheep in the river canyons.
That's probably true today, yeah, I would say.
I'm just curious if the same issues with MOV pertain in the desert canyons as in the areas you study.
There is MOV in the desert. It's been associated with some pretty severe pneumonia outbreaks in Arizona, California. Even New Mexico has had some. I think we're really interested in, and my colleague Kezia, who's in our consortium and is a professor at Utah State, she is working in Zion, and we're really interested to learn more about the disease in desert sheep, because I think it is a little different. I don't think it's necessarily because desert bighorn sheep are different. It's just, it may be different in exposure to domestics. Also, the populations are they're lower density, and they're just, things might work a little differently, so, yeah. But it is a problem there too, yeah.
So when they do some transporting or reintroducing, do they test for this before they reintroduce?
We do now.
So this is the state of Idaho. So like would other states test before they would reintroduce?
They would now, yeah. Yep.
And that's only been for the last few years, though.
Yeah, so, well, we didn't know about it before 2006, and then probably it, took a while to get sort of accepted and proven, and so yeah, probably the last 5 years.
So Francis, you kind of made light of the domestic sheep in Hell's Canyon, for example. Over the past 20 or so years, there has been a reduction in sheep allotments there. Isn't that correct?
Right, because of the National Recreation Area. And I didn't mention, maybe I made light of the whole thing because, this has been the subject of a lot of court cases, and it's not over, So it's been a big issue. The reason that they were removed from Hell's Canyon was because, at the time anyway, which was a court case, was because of the National Recreation Area. Also, I don't know, are there any domestic sheep people here? No. Okay, well, so I'll speak to this. I don't want to say it wrong, but definitely the domestic sheep industry has declined for various reasons, not related to bighorn sheep. And so that's also made it was easier, like some allotments in Hell's Canyon just went away, or they went to cattle. So, yeah, it was a big battle.
A second part of that question that I have is, so through the sheep tag lottery, about $109,000 was just raised. It seems like a wise use of that money might be to look at buying out some more sheep allotments.
Yeah, I think pretty sure it's in the, what is it, 36, our code, that we cannot buy out domestic sheep allotments with that money.
But couldn't the Sheep Foundation pursue that?
Yeah, and they have. Yeah.
Just seems like a wise thing to do, just like the Morgan Creek herd and the White Cloud populations. They are exposed to domestic sheep. And this is a wilderness area back here, and of course the Morgan Creek herd is right on the edge of a wilderness. And we have sheep coming into the Sawtooth Valley here from the Loon Creek, Cabin Creek Peak, Jordan Peak area, and we have,
like permittees on.
Yeah, and we have sheep permits right here in the valley.
Yeah, so that's probably something we want to think about before we start trying to clear MOV, because there's no point in clearing it if they're just going to get exposed again. Yes.
Are there other substantial causes of mortality among wild sheep besides?
Well, certainly, yes. Not like the MOB that's just driven them down to this small size, but yes, they're subject to the same things that other wildlife is, and probably, so predation.
Oh, of course,
Yeah.
Predation, hunting,
And habitat, yeah.
The usual things that all wildlife.
Yeah.
But nothing specific for sheep besides.
No.
I was just curious,
Sorry.
wasn't I believe I'm correct in saying, wasn't scabies the original scourge of the
Yeah, that's another one.
of the bighorns, and has that been more or less eliminated?
I think scabies is kind of a mystery what happened. It's very obvious, definitely they got it, and it's not clear even that where they got it from. Like people thought they thought it got it from domestic sheep, but the scabies we have scabies now in Hell's Canyon. I think it's still in some of the Salmon River populations. The bighorn sheep can, when they're naive, it causes a lot of mortality. So I don't think it's native to them, but I don't know where it came from. But once they have had it for a while, they can get immunity to it. It affects the lambs more than anything, like everything.
You said the lowest got about a 60% mortality rate. Does 40% don't die?
They do, yeah. But they just don't pass that on to their lambs, and they don't. And then there's the ones that don't have full immunity, so they're still carrying the pathogen. And I should say those all happen to be about 60%. There's a wide range. It can be up to 90%, or as low as 30%.
My question might not have anything to do with this.
I thought we could move on to something else.
So, no, I was curious, mountain goats, do they fit into any of this anywhere?
Mountain goats can also carry MOV.
Okay.
And in fact, we know, so if any of you have had a sheep or goat tag, anybody here had a sheep or goat tag lately? No. Pretty hard to get, but we are now asking hunters to give us samples and bring the heads in, and we'll sample them as well. And we've found MOV in the mountain goats and the white clouds. So.
Are they more the carrier type of animal then, or does it also have disastrous implications at 60+%?
We don't really know. I mean, there is some indication that it can be negative for mountain goats too. But I think that's something we'd really need to know more about. Yeah.
How much of their territory do mountain goats and sheep
Overlap?
overlap? Yes.
That's a good question. I'm not really a mountain goat person. I mean, I've seen goats and sheep in the mountains, but they will overlap up, and I think there's transmission between them. They do have some different habitat requirements or preferences, so there is separation as well.
What are their natural predators, and also can you talk a bit about the social life of bighorn sheep? I mean, do they travel in groups? What's the use of their
Plan. Okay, the biggest predator of bighorn sheep, or the most successful predator, is mountain lions. Like one reason bighorn sheep live where they live is because wolves won't go there. You know, wolves are not, or they're just not. Wolves and coyotes are not effective in that kind of terrain. Mountain lions, you know, they're still kind of tricky for them, but they're stalking and they can do better on sheep. Golden eagles will get the lambs usually, you know, not usually, but if they get a sheep, it will usually be lambs. And it's kind of interesting, like when I took a video crew out in Hell's Canyon this spring, and they had a drone and they wanted to fly it, and I'm like, and you know, I let them try it over the sheep, and all the lambs just kind of like went right under their mom, and you know, the moms were like right up against the rocks, so you know, they know golden eagles. So, and then as far as the social life of ewes, yes, they tend to be in groups, and it's kind of cool because if you've ever tried to sneak up on bighorn sheep, you know, some of them can just be like out cold. You don't think animals are sleeping like really deeply, but they are. But there's always one that's kind of like you sneak up and then busted, you know. So that's why they live in, or that's an advantage of living in groups, and for them and their lambs. And you know, they'll be in different sort of, we call it like fish infusion. So it's not like they have set groups. They just are in a group, and then they move over here, and then they might meet up with this other group, and then they split up, and there's different, you know, they don't necessarily split back in their original groups, so they just kind of, they're on the move quite a bit.
Do domestic goats carry the MOV that they can introduce to mountain goats and sheep?
They do. It seems like we've done some sort of evolutionary history, sort of like creating a phylogenetic tree, where you can go back, we look at the strains and see how they branch out, and the strains from domestic goats branch separately from the strains in domestic sheep, you know, suggesting they've evolved with domestic sheep and domestic goats. So they're kind of, there's like a goat kind of a MOB and a sheep kind of an MOB. And the goat MOB, we think, is much less common in bighorn sheep. And, partly it could be that there's less contact with domestic goats, but I think like in the Southwest, actually, there's probably more, at least historically, more goats than sheep that were grazed. So, but what we think is that the goat strain just doesn't establish itself as well in bighorn sheep as the sheep strain.
Is it a direct contact?
I don't know about mountain goats. So.
Is it a direct contact transmission, or is it a residual?
It's direct. It has to have a live host.
So
yeah, it doesn't last. It doesn't persist in the environment or anything. That's one good thing about it.
it's suddenly obvious.
I'll answer after.
The sheep's horns continue to grow throughout their.
They do. They kind of slow down.
Yeah.
And I guess people probably know this, but you can actually, I meant to say this on the slide, but you can actually age especially the rams from their horns. So they have these, what we call annuli, and so they're growing, like he grew all his first year, you may not be able to see it, but if you come up here later, and then in the winter, he stopped growing, and that's the annulus, and then this is what he grew when he was 2 years old. And it will go on throughout their life. As they get older, they don't grow as much. So yeah, they don't never drop them. They're not like antlers. They keep them for their life. And then the ewes, it's a little harder because they pretty much grow really fast the first couple years, and then they really grow really slow, and they don't seem. It's really hard to tell the annuli. I'm sure they have them, but and I think it's different in different environments. Like up here, there would be very strong annuli because there's a very severe winter, whereas in places where there's not much of a winter, sometimes there might not be a very easily detectable annulus.
Is it legal to pick up skulls, sheep skulls, and keep them? I know in Washington it isn't.
It isn't. In Idaho it is. You have to bring them in within 10 days to get pinned, and it has to have died naturally.
So what's a normal or average or healthy lifespan
Of a bighorn sheep. So anybody have an idea? The males and females are different. Which one do you think lives longer? The females live longer. Quite a bit longer. Well, for one thing, the rut is really bad timing, They don't eat during the rut, and then they have winter. So they're it's not really set up for them. But yeah, 8 to 10, about 10, yeah, maybe 12 years, but yeah, 8 to 12 years. So there's like the longest lifespan, but I'd say average might be 8 to 10 years for a male, and probably about 15 years for female. They can live up to 18 years, maybe even a little older. We have some in captivity that are carriers that we took out of and some of them were really old, and they're 20. And they're still carrying MOB too. But normally, yeah, 15 for. So they're quite long-lived.
So, another question. What's the difference, or is it just a different name of Dall sheep?
It's a different species of sheep.
Okay.
Yeah, there's two species of sheep in North America. There's bighorn sheep, and then there's what we call thin-horn sheep. And so bighorn sheep are the Rocky Mountain and the desert. And California, we have California here in Idaho. It's not really supported as a separate anything, but we treat it, we still manage it differently, but it kind of groups into the Rocky Mountains. And then the thin-horn sheep are Dall sheep and stone sheep. And they're in Canada and Alaska. Yeah. And they don't have MOB there.
They don't.
Yeah. Well, maybe a little bit in Canada, but not in the Dall sheep. So they're actually, Alaska is doing some proactive things to keep it out of the state. So. Well, thanks again, everyone.